Hey guys, welcome back to another episode. Thanks for tuning in. Today I've got a viewer's question that I want to talk about. So, for all of you that are watching, if you have similar questions or questions on different topics that you want me to talk about, please shoot me the comment. I'd be happy to discuss them. To all of you that have subscribed already to the channel, thank you very much. If you haven't, hit that subscribe button. I could use all the help I can get. It makes doing these videos worthwhile knowing that people enjoy them and are watching. And today's topic is from a viewer, and specifically the viewer wants to know when I throw a jig versus throwing a Texas rig. And in general, my answer to that is there's not going to be a huge difference in the number of bites. At least I don't feel like if I threw a Texas rig in a spot and got bit, that the chances of, had I put a jig in the exact same spot, that I wouldn't have gotten bit. So I like to think that they are pretty interchangeable, but there are definitely times I prefer to throw a jig or I prefer to throw a Texas rig. And specifically, let's talk about the jig first. So the jig to me is a really good spring bait and later in the year bait, so fall into winter. I think the fish are generally looking for a little larger item to eat. And I think in the spring specifically, you've got crawfish movement with them coming out of their hibernation holes. And I think the bass will key in on them. So I think, the jig is kind of the ultimate crawfish imitator. And then again, in the fall, I think those fish are looking for bigger items to eat. And a lot of times you start getting good crawfish movement again because they're getting ready and digging their holes to hibernate in. So there's another kind of transition to that crawdad bite later in the year as well. With a jig, because of the profile being bigger, I do prefer to throw it in dirtier water. If I'm fishing muddy water, I'll almost always tend to go with a jig over a Texas rig just because it moves so much more water. There's so much more water displacement that allows those fish to be able to find your bait and hone in on it. If I'm fishing a predominantly largemouth fishery, I'll tend to go with a jig more than a Texas rig if I'm fishing any sort of hard cover. So wood, lay down, stumps, rock. I just find that a jig comes through that stuff better. And if I'm fishing a predominantly a largemouth fishery, I'm trying to generate bigger bites, and I think you'll get more bigger bites on a jig than potentially on a Texas rig. It seems like your average size fish is a little bigger on the Texas rig, whereas with a jig, whereas on a Texas rig, you catch more of those 10 to 12 inch fish. But I don't know that you'd miss out on that 3 or 4 pounder that bit the jig either. I'm just saying, I think the average bite is bigger on a jig. And if I'm on a largemouth fishery, specifically one that's known as has better quality fish, I like to go with the jig over the Texas rig. If I'm fishing rivers, I really like to throw the jig. Again, it has to do with creating that water disbursement and creating a bigger object for those fish to see in the current. The caveat to that is, if it's heavy current, I do not like to go with the jig. The Texas rig is much more streamlined and will get down to the bottom or through the cover without letting the current sweep the bait away, which if you're in heavy current will happen easier with the jig. So I'd rather then switch to a Texas rig rather than switching to a much heavier jig. It just seems like the jig will get swept away in the current better. But if it's a light current, a nice kind of meandering current, the jig is the way to go because you will create that disbursement. It's a bigger object, and again, those fish can hone in on it. And when you're dealing with rivers, a lot of times, especially in heavy current, if that bait misses the strike zone by 3 inches, they won't come out of their eddy or wherever they're hiding to get that bait, which is what makes it more important to be able to get your bait down into that strike zone faster. So that's, for me, that's personal preference. I feel like for river fishing, I really like the jig, but if it's too heavy of a current, I switch over to the Texas rig to make sure my bait's still in the strike zone. So, to counter that with the Texas rig, one of the main times I throw a Texas rig is if I'm fishing grass. I feel like the Texas rig is much more efficient in grass, comes through it better, punches down into it. And when I say punch, I'm not necessarily talking about uh, like vegetation on the surface that you're punching through. I'm talking about like if you just got submerged milfoil or submerged coontail or hydrilla, that your Texas rig will fall through that better and get into the holes that the fish are in. Whereas a jig will get caught up, or at least the weed guard or certain parts of the bait could get caught in the grass, and just it doesn't make it as efficient. And with me, I'm all about efficiency. So if I can make sure my Texas rig is getting where those fish are on 3 out of 4 casts in grass versus 2 out of 4 casts with the jig, I'd rather go with the Texas rig, even if I think the jig might be, it might generate a bigger bite or something like that. In the summer, I do think a Texas rig is better for a couple of reasons. One, I think the Texas rig a lot of times can do a good job at mimicking bluegill and bait fish and other types of fish forage species versus a crawfish. I do feel like a jig I think this can mimic a bluegill as well, but I really think it's geared more towards being a bottom bait and kind of mimicking the crawfish. With a Texas rig, I just think it's a much more lively bait, I would say. You can get them to glide if you put a light Texas rig on this, or a light weight on this bait, say a quarter ounce. I mean, this bait will do some good gliding and mimic a bluegill or a bait fish really well. And in the summer, those fish are a lot of times they're keying in more on bait fish or bluegill versus crawfish. So I do like the Texas rig in the summer. The other aspect to that goes with the weed. The summer is usually when you have your biggest weed growth, and therefore I do like to throw the Texas rig for the reasons I just mentioned in the weed. And again, what I said before too with the punching, if I'm fishing anything that does have some topped out grass or some thicker mats, whether those are log jams or debris piles that are in the back of pockets or lily pads, that type of thing, again, I like to go with the Texas rig just because it's more efficient. It gets through that stuff without getting hung up as much, and it just puts my bait in front of those fish. So those are really the main differences between the jig and the Texas rig for me. I love both techniques, and overall I've won a ton of money on both of them. And usually if I am in an environment where I'm pitching, I usually have both rigged up anyways, and it becomes one of those things where maybe the jig is what I'm throwing 90% of the time, and then I come to a good log jam or a good debris pile, and I need to punch through it, and I pick up my Texas rig. So I usually have both rigged. It seems like to me, they're interchangeable to a point, but there are times I prefer to throw one versus the other. So I hope that helps. I hope that broke it down a little bit and it didn't create more confusion for you. I think it's a valuable technique to go with. The jig is a great bait. Texas rigs are a great bait, and they catch a ton of fish. So guys, if you got other things you want me to talk about or kind of describe why I do what I do, leave me a comment. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I appreciate all of you that are watching, and tune in. We got videos coming out every other day, so tune in tomorrow for tomorrow's tip. Thanks for watching.